writing workshop lesson where we're going to be creating some new poems of our own by starting with this question: are restrictions expressive or stifling? You might be confused by that question, so I'm going to explain it in more detail in a moment. Throughout this video, you will need to pay attention because it gives you the information you need to write the kinds of poems we want you to write today. We're going to give you a little quiz right afterwards to make sure that you've understood the key points and give you the opportunity to go back and revise any learning that you didn't get the first time around. So, to start with, this question that I've put on the board: are restrictions expressive or stifling? So there's three important words there. The first one is restriction. A restriction is a rule that limits what you can do. And when we write poems, there's lots of ways we can put restrictions on what we do. Something like rhyme is a restriction on what we do. If a poem is expressive, it freely shows feelings and emotions. It gives the writer's ideas as freely as possible, with nothing holding them back. And third, a word that some of you have definitely seen before: a stifling situation makes you feel uncomfortable because you cannot do what you want. So with those three words on the board now, if you needed to be reminded of them, you can see that our question, are restrictions expressive or stifling, is just asking whether a restriction can help you freely express feelings and emotions. Can it somehow lead you to show your emotions more truly? Or will restrictions in poetry make you feel uncomfortable because you can't do what you want? We've got two options there for the way restrictions work. Let's just think about what a restriction would mean in poetry. Because we often think about poetry in terms of freedom, liberation, and doing what we like. But when we look at the history of poetry, we realise that poets often choose to limit themselves in some way. One example of that is the sonnet. There's a photograph of the original book where Shakespeare's Sonnet 130 appeared. The sonnet's 14 lines long. It has a very, very strict rhyme pattern, a very strict line length as well. So there's lots of restrictions when you write a sonnet, but somehow people have managed to create very, very expressive sonnets that talk all about their feelings and love for people. That's not the only kind of restriction we could have. Another restriction that perhaps you've seen before in one way or another is poets who write in shapes. So there's two examples there. One of George Herbert, who wrote in the shape of wings, of angels or birds' wings, and one by a more recent poet who wrote in the shape of a swan, and not just a swan, but a swan with a shadow on the water, or its reflection on the water. If you imagine a swan swimming along on a lake and they've got their mirror image reflection down below. Another kind of restriction you might have come across is the acrostic. And this is an example by the American poet Edgar Allan Poe. And he's written an acrostic there on the name Elizabeth. So we're not going to read it in detail, but you can see down the left-hand side is the name Elizabeth, and then every line uses that letter to say what it has to say. So it's clear that all these poets are using restrictions to actually express themselves a bit more fully, to create expressive writing that's interesting. So we're going to not explore any of these in more detail today. We're going to explore a form or restriction called the golden shovel, because I think it would be really interesting to find out whether you find this expressive or stifling. Golden shovel, what on earth is that? If anyone knows what this is already, I'll be really impressed. I'm going to assume no one does, and we have to go through right from the beginning. To explain what a golden shovel is, I need to introduce you to two poets. The first is Gwendolyn Brooks, who lived from 1917 to 2000. She's an American poet and is one of the top poets of the 20th century. She won in 1950 a really important prize called the Pulitzer Prize in America, and you can actually see on her desk right there is the book she won it for, called Annie Allen. Gwendolyn Brooks is not only interesting because she's such a good poet, she's interesting because lots and lots of modern poets read her and think to themselves, I really like her poetry, I'm going to write a little bit like her. And if you talk to a lot of American poets, especially, a lot of them will say she's a real inspiration for them. One of those people who found Gwendolyn Brooks an inspiration is this man, Terence Hayes, who's another poet. He's still alive. So he was born in 1971, so I guess he'll be around 50 this year. Terence Hayes is another influential, important person who's written loads of great poems, but has also inspired lots of other people to write. He's inspired lots of Americans, but even if you talk to poets in Britain, and maybe especially black poets, they will say Terence Hayes is an important figure for them. So we're going to be looking at these two poets, and maybe just to give us a little clue about what we need to know. It's interesting that both of these poets, the pictures I've shown you, they're sat in front of loads and loads of books. These are people who write poems, but they also read poems. They love to see all the poems that other people have written. Maybe that will give us some kind of clue about what a golden shovel is. The first poem we need to look at is by Gwendolyn Brooks, and it's called The Pool Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. The Golden Shovel in this poem would be probably a bar or a place where people play pool. We've got a little picture to the left of the slide, which I think gives a nice illustration. I'm not sure if this was painted to go with this poem, but it certainly has some of the same spirit. This poem was written in 1960, so now over 60 years ago, and I think really connects with some of the spirit of that time. So this is The Pool Players. We reel cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. So, such a short poem, it almost seems like nothing happens, but we've got 7 sentences with 7 different people giving their point of view. Now, it sounds at the start of the poem like they're having a really great time. They think they're cool because they left school when they were young. They didn't carry on to college. But when we read through the poem and we get to the end, they say, we die soon. So maybe it's a bit worrying as well. Even if they're having a great time right now, they kind of know that their lives are going to be short. And maybe it's because they spent too much time playing pool. The second poem we're going to read is by Terence Hayes. And this is called The Golden Shovel. So already maybe we can see a connection, because Brooks's poem was called The Golden Shovel, or it was at the Golden Shovel, and Terence Hayes' poem is called The Golden Shovel. So there's some connection going on here. I'm just going to read it out, and I just want you to think to yourself, what connection could there possibly be between this poem and the poem we just read? When I am so small, Dar's sock covers my arm. We cruise at twilight until we find the place the real men lean, bloodshot and translucent with cool. His smile is a gold-plated incantation as we drift by women on bar stools, with nothing left in them but approachlessness. This is a school I do not know yet. but the cue sticks mean we are rubbed by light, smooth as wood. The lurk of smoke thinned to song. We won't be out late. This time, we've got a much longer story. And I'll mention too, I've just taken a short part of Terence Hayes' poem. There's much more to it than this, but it's a much longer story, whether we take a little bit or a bit longer. He's writing from a really different point of view. He's a small child driving around with his father, going into places that sound actually quite inappropriate for a child. A small child shouldn't be going and meeting a barman with big gold teeth, or maybe not these women who are just hanging out on the bar stools. This creates this school I do not know yet. A place where he's going to learn something new and different, but possibly something scary, maybe something that's not going to be so helpful for him. This part of the poem ends by saying, we won't be out late. We won't be out late. But I think we would have to wait and see whether or not that's going to be true. Are they going to be out late, engaged in dangerous, risky business, or are they going to go home, go back to bed where this little boy can get some rest? So what's the connection between these two poems? If we can understand the connection, then we will know what a golden shovel is. They just seem to be totally different. One writes with really short sentences, whereas one seems much more free to do whatever it likes. Maybe the topics are sort of similar, but the two poems don't seem especially well connected. But actually, what happens when we look at the end of each line? We see a little bit of rhyme, words like cool and school. But if we look really closely at every word that ends each line, we might start to see a pattern emerging. The words seem quite familiar. We real cool, we left school. And of course, these are the exact same words that came out of Gwendolyn Brooks' poem. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late. So that's the first bit of Gwendolyn Brooks' poem. So now we've learned what a golden shovel is. You write a golden shovel when you take the words of one poem and use them at the end of each line of your new poem. And Terence Hayes' poem, The Golden Shovel, is a great example of this. So it's a simple approach. It gives you a restriction, but it also helps you maybe to say some new things that you didn't think of. And maybe what I like most about the form of the golden shovel is that it means we can go back to poems that we really like, that we think are important, and we can create our own connection with them. It's a bit like we have an affiliation or a community with that poet, even if they're not alive anymore. We can show how much we like their poems and how much we're inspired by their example to create our own material. So I'm going to send you back now to do a short quiz, and then hopefully we'll be able to write some golden shovels of our own by the end of the lesson.